My article is titled The Civil Rights Movement in the American West, Black Protests in Seattle from 1960 to 1970. I actually chose this article because I am from Seattle originally, so I wanted to analyze what the civil rights movement was like in my hometown. Quinter Taylor, the author of this article, has a few main arguments regarding the movement and why Americans are so fascinated by it. First off, he states that the deepest of Seattle's racist sins is ignorance. Whites living in Seattle tended to isolate themselves from any concern or knowledge about the nearby black population, and as a result, they looked at blacks with mild distaste at their funny way of life. This may have been fuel to the protesters' fire when it came to educating whites. Another argument Taylor made was that the civil rights movement in Seattle should have been viewed as a national transformation because it energized African American communities throughout the country. The movement was inspired by national goals but also by pursuing local needs. The point I wanted to make about this article as well was the differences in racism between the South and Seattle. Blacks living in Seattle recognized that the racism in the Pacific Northwest was not nearly as intense and violent than in the South, but still experienced some difference. Because of the lack of violence, the protests and marches were not as violent compared to the Southern uprisings. Finally, the main argument and point of this article were the three main injustices blacks felt they were going through and did something about. First was the obvious job discrimination in downtown Seattle. In 1961, the newly formed chapters of CORE, Congress of Racial Equality, protested Nordstrom, JCPenney, and other businesses using the direct action method of picketing in front of businesses. They would also perform shop-ins where they would fill up grocery carts with groceries, went to checkout to ring everything up, and just leave. By 1964, CORE realized little had been done to alter jobs for blacks and had no spectacular victories. However, many groups such as the city itself, the Chamber of Commerce, and Employment Opportunity Center were forced to realize the need for changes and gain recognition. The next campaign performed during this time was against open housing. African Americans were basically stuck in this region of Seattle called the Central District, and they wanted the freedom and anti-discrimination rights to live outside this area. This was the only place that didn't experience discrimination over buying a home. This opposition by the minorities was intense as they went to the mayor for a new ordinance, went on huge marches, got a measure on the 1964 ballot, and much more protests. In 1968, they actually passed an open house measure which enabled blacks to receive equal treatment when buying a house outside the Central District, and the migration away from there began. The final movement blacks desired change for was de facto school segregation. All black schools were located in the Central District, which made the civil rights leaders realize what this does to blacks. They learned to hate. Segregation was not by law, it was a result of the ignorance of the whites thinking there was no problem. Over time, with marches and protests, the Seattle School Board undertook a district-wide desegregation plan with the goal of sending 1,400 black students from the Central District to other schools. In the long run, this movement was the least successful of the three as it caused issues for Central District schools to stay open. When looking at the other articles this semester, I found that this was most similar to the one titled Student Activism, the NAACP, and the Albuquerque City Anti-Discrimination Ordinance, 1947 and 1952. The reason for this is because both of these civil rights movements were initiated by local issues such as indifference in restaurants and segregation in schools. Also, the NAACP branches were both big contributors to the movement and leading protests in both of these cities. These two articles were also similar because it showed discrimination over all minorities, not just blacks, also Hispanics in Albuquerque and Asians in Seattle. In terms of new information, there was a lot learned from this article. There were 2,000 workers employed in 65 Seattle restaurants, but none had black hostesses, managers, cashiers, or waitresses. This was interesting and fueled the job discrimination protests. Also, 14% of the dishwashers were African American and 100% were janitors. This was a survey done by CORE prior to these job discrimination protests. And the last fact that I found interesting was that in 1967, Seattle became the second city behind Cleveland to receive a $138,000 grant from the Ford Foundation for Operation Equity. These were interesting and all went together because it's interesting to realize the indifference blacks had in Seattle that a lot of people weren't aware of, and overall it was less violent and less aggressive than the Southern treatment. I do agree with this idea that white Seattleites are ignorant to Blacks' way of life. As you can see in a lot of the protests, the whites were not a big influencer, and they mostly just turned a blind eye to the discrimination that was being upheld in the city. And it's not as much today, but back then in the 1900s, it was definitely a big point, and you could see that in the data. Overall reflection of this article is very positive. It really shows how the people of Seattle, as Blacks specifically, migrated up to Seattle, to the Pacific Northwest. They really broke down some barriers in terms of job segregation and housing bias and school segregation. It really just shows that the struggle for racial injustice was not just a Southern campaign. It was every corner of the nation and inspired by local issues. Thank you.